Hi, I'm Dr. Diana Hill. Thank you so much for joining me with Your Life in Process. And if you want more, if you're interested in applying these processes to your daily life, join me at my membership, More Life in Process. At More Life in Process, you will get meditations for you to practice at home. You'll get extra bits from the episode that maybe got recorded after the fact. You're going to get PDFs and handouts, things that you can use to apply your daily practice to your life. And I can't wait to see you there. $5 a month, $50 for the year. You can go to yourlifeinprocess.com to sign up. I launched the week with I'm talking to Mike about the fun habit, and I feel like this week ahead has no fun in it. I am so bogged down with too many to-dos. In particular, this week is just a really, really busy one. And I almost don't even want to hear it. It's sort of my mom will say sometimes, because my dad's a Buddhist, sometimes she'll say, sometimes I just want to yell at the washing machine and not get some Buddhist insights.
That's funny.
So I was feeling a little bit like that. Like, I don't want you to tell me to have more fun because I'm sitting in my misery. And it was actually exactly what I needed. I loved bringing this into the week and applying your work to this sort of somewhat miserable, what I was perceiving as a miserable week. It wasn't that bad. So thank you
I
as a
appreciate
start.
that. And I think, I mean, that's a great metaphor for like how it's become problematic, right? I think, even, we're all going to have weeks where the sling and arrows crowd out fun, right? But the idea that, whether you want to call it self-care or whatever, you know, knowing that like, like if you can feel the burden and like live in that discomfort, like understand like that's actually, the draw to the invitation that maybe you do need to prioritize it, if not this week when you have that space, right?
Yeah. Well, it was actually kind of like the worst possible thing happening to you that led you to write this book. So it wasn't even like, I just need a little more fun in my life. It was the complete painful experience. Can you share a little bit about that, of what launched you into the fun habit? And then we're going to go into and unpack fun and what you mean by it and all of that. But start with its origins for you.
Yeah, so I'm a charter member of the International Positive Psychology Association, and why that's important to the origin story is that I'm a big believer in those tools, right? I believe, I love the fact that we're using psychology now for betterment. And for folks that don't know what positive psychology is, it's essentially a facet of psychology that was born a little bit after the turn of the millennium, to use psychological tools, not just for, um, you know, clinical intervention with regards to poor mental hygiene and poor clinical outcomes, but ways that you could use tools of psychology for betterment. And so I started to drink from the fire hose, once that kind of tribe came forth, uh, and all those tools were working really well. But I think now in the rear view mirror, um, what I now understand is that I had overprescribed to him, and a lot of us have. Right now, we have a term for it. It's called toxic positivity, right? But I'd really become overly concerned with like trying to squeeze out happiness of every moment. The same way some people try to squeeze productivity out of every moment.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it had been somewhat successful. I mean, I was kind of on cloud nine up until 2016, when, like life does, life threw me, some some events that knocked me on my butt. And so the big one was my younger brother unexpectedly passed away from a pulmonary embolism. And so, I think up until that point, I hadn't really experienced intimately the finality of life, the fact that we are only here for a certain amount of time. And so that was a big wake up call, but I wasn't necessarily willing to accept it yet. And so that became problematic. And at the same time, the way that I'd really enjoyed my leisure time, and to be quite honest, it was a useful way to mitigate low level anxiety, was that I had a running habit. I really enjoyed it, and found out a couple months after my brother's passing, and these two aren't related, but, were just unfortunately timed around the same time, that I had likely had an undiagnosed injury, and which resulted in advanced osteoarthritis, and I had to get a hip replacement. So these two big things, right? One, like essentially uh, now becoming an only child and all of that, mourning my brother's the loss of my brother, and then this identity of being a runner, which was essentially who I was, and not being taken away from me. And but I had been, somewhat Pollyanna, for the last decade, and it worked, like
Mm.
overemphasize on optimism. And so I, made myself believe that I could just pull myself out of this malaise. I wasn't mourning my brother's loss. I was kind of, trying to find ways to be grateful, even though, like in the back of my mind, it wasn't an appropriate response. And the more that I was chasing happiness, the more miserable I was becoming. And luckily, because I have some level of self awareness, I sort of realized it was happening. I was getting close to a clinical condition. Um, but I was like, okay, something here is problematic. And I just finished my doctoral work in organizational psychology. And I was like, okay, this has become problematic. There's got to be something out there, like something that I can grab onto. And serendipitously, I got introduced to a researcher out of the University of California, Berkeley. Her name's Dr. Iris Mouse, who's now been looking at this phenomena for some time. But at the time, the research was fairly fresh. And that is this Western ideal of happiness. So, um, our over concern of like good vibes only all the time. So not necessarily wanting people to flourish and be happy, but like this, you know, this kind of endless pursuit has really led to a lot of people being really unhappy paradoxically. And I was like, oh my gosh, I fit this mold, right? And so that's great. These kind of awakenings, like, okay, so all of these tools that have been fairly successful are now harming me because of the, emotional state that I'm in. And so that was the entryway into the book. Like, there's got to be a better way. And so, I began my journey, figuring out how it's going to get out of this hole.
Yeah. Well, so yeah, life seems to come in sets. I like ocean swimming, and it does seem that there's a big wave. And then as soon as you come up for air, another big wave happens. And then another big wave happens. And then it can be like eons before any waves happen again. Like, it could be like years.
Yeah,
Right. So they
I
do
love that.
tend to happen that way. And when you're in it, you get all turned upside down. And that can be a good thing, because maybe some of the ways in which you've been responding and going about your life, they need to be changed. Like a pivot needs to happen. And in some ways, if you think about the title of this book, or even fun, or even my resistance to it this week, was about, oh, isn't that another kind of toxic positivity? Just have fun. Any kind of sentence that starts with just, right? So just have fun, just accept, just be happy is has this sort of like strong-armed willfulness of pulling someone into fun. But you're talking about a different kind of fun. So I want to operationalize, define what you mean by fun, and then go through some of the practices that you teach in the book for our listeners, so they can actually like try it on, and I can share about what I've tried this week,
Yeah,
as well.
absolutely.
But yeah, so how are you defining fun, and how is it different than pleasure? Is it the same as pleasure? How is it different than meaning? Is it the same? What is your
Yeah, so I
definition?
take a very clinical approach and a wide tent. So in psychology, we have something called valence, and essentially what that means is, are you enjoying what you're doing? Is whatever you're doing sort of pulling you towards it, which is positive valence, or is it something that's depleting, something that you don't enjoy that kind of repels you? Like, I really wish I wasn't doing this, which is negative valent. And
Mm.
so, um, for me, the broad, big tent rather, big tent definition is anything that you enjoy doing, right? Like, are you looking at, I like the construct of 168 hours, because it's really easy to wrap your head around. I mean, that's how many hours we have in a week. Like, are you enjoying when you're awake, the hours that you're spending within your week, or is everything you're doing not really filling you up? And so, it's really this action orientation towards the activities and the work that you engage in. Are they things that you like doing, or are they things that you don't like doing? And so
Mhm.
it's pretty Boleyn, right? Like, are you enjoying this time, or are is this time kind of wearing you out?
So you have something called the play model, which is a diagram that folks can fill out. And on the x-axis is from easy to hard, sort of like the challenge of something. And then on the y-axis is from low fun to high fun. So I guess it would be low enjoyment to high enjoyment. And then
Exactly.
you get these different sections, right? So something that is high fun, high enjoyment would bring you, I guess, a lot of vitality. You call that
Living.
living.
Yeah, so Four Quadrant models are, a useful tool, right? Because I think they kind of
Yeah.
simplify the science. I certainly, give a tip of the hat to Lisa Feldman Barrett because it's very much, based on her research on emotion. But
Hmm.
yeah, I think it becomes a useful tool. I meant just to give a little bit of background for people that can't, you know, visualize the model in their head. It has four different quadrants, and play stands for pleasing, living, agonizing, and yielding. And it's essentially a way to look at how you're spending your time. And so pleasing and living are the two quadrants that are things that you enjoy doing. And so living are everyday sort of pleasantries. And I base this work off of Matthew Killingsworth, the idea of mind wandering, like when we're not really enjoying our time, when we're engaging in things like passive leisure, things like doom scrolling, right? Or just kind of, anything that where if I asked you 2 weeks from now, how are you spending that time? You're like, oh, I don't really know, right? Um, those those types of passive things aren't really enjoyable, right? And we know that if we're not integrating, you moments where we do enjoy ourselves, so that could be like friendships, time with your pets, really simple things, even just reading a book that you really enjoy, anything that we call, quote unquote, active leisure. That's, when if I asked you, how did this make you feel? Did it lead to betterment? Like, did you enjoy that time? You're going to vividly remember it because it was important enough that you encoded those memories.
Hmm.
Um, the living quadrant are things that are harder to do. So those tend to generally be fun, but you can't do them all the time. Right. And so those usually like lead to mastery. It could be a spiritual practice. It could be like vigorous hikes in nature. And so those are the building blocks of things that we know lead to self development. But oftentimes, if you over prescribe to them, they can burn you out. So you kind of need to be careful. The most insidious stuff, though, is the stuff that falls, in the agonizing and yielding quadrant, right? Because a lot of our life now, especially after the pandemic, is habituated in these two quadrants. And if there's too much of that in your week, they just become depleting, right? I meant what I bring up in the book, which is kind of my aha moment as I started to develop all the research for this, is a principle called the hedonic flexibility principle. And what we know is when, even if you think that you're being super productive and, you're living a life through this sense of duty, whether it be, the Protestant work ethic or, the what we're calling the sandwich generation, where you're essentially living for your kids and your aging parents. Um, if you're not enjoying some of your time, you end up, you know, burning out, or at the very least, not being the best version of yourself. And most of the time, actually, a lot less productive than you actually could be if you took some time off the table for yourself.
Yeah. So we have these four quadrants. The one quadrant has to do with living, and that's being challenged and having fun. And when I filled out that quadrant, it's very much like doing things like interviewing people and leading workshops and traveling to new places and putting myself a little bit outside of my comfort zone. That's totally energizing, right? To do that type of thing. And then but we also need to balance it with some of the things that are just easy and also fun, like walking your dog or working in the garden or in your kitchen or whatever. So those two are the places that I think get there's sort of an invasive species of like productivity and sort of this anguish doing hard stuff that you don't really like to do, and then mindlessness, which is the scrolling on the phones, which has to do with the either lots of effort and low fun or low effort and low fun. And for many of us, myself included, when I was looking at this week, it was mostly lots of effort with low fun this week. And so I had to look at, okay, how do I bring, sometimes it's not even changing your activity, it's also changing the way you are within your activity. So I did some of that. Let's start with time, because that is almost like that's the limiting reagent for many of us in terms of how do we have more of the living in the challenge and the fun and the ease and the fun. Many of us will say we just don't have enough time for that. I have to get all my anguish stuff done first.
No, but so when you peel that back almost, 99% of the time, plus or minus, that's just not going to be accurate, right? So in the book, I fall back on research from Dr. Cassie Holmes, who also has her amazing book called The Happiest Hour. And
Yeah, and she was on this podcast, so folks can go listen to her, yeah, and her research on time. Mhm.
she also leaned on survey data. I did as well, but then she also, went a step further. And we just know that most people generally do have at least 2 to 5 hours that they can in some way manipulate so that it's considered leisure, so that it's invigorating rather than depleting, right? And so even if you have a super busy schedule, I kind of like to boil it down to just a math problem to become aware, right? I mean, there's 168 hours. So even if you're getting ample sleep, like 56, right? Like that still leaves over 100 hours. Are you really working like 70 hours a week? Okay, fine. Well, that still means that you have 20 hours that should be your own. And so how are you spending that time? And even if it is, with loved ones, right? Like your kids, like is all of that through the lens of I have to do this? Because generally, to your point, it can just be a reframe. Like, hey, this is our time. So let's reorganize it in a way that's like fun for us rather than just everything being from the sense of duty, where essentially any task you have that falls in that model, right, is an extension of work. And what we know is once you get into that mode, you're not going to be able to even do work. So like that's where it becomes an easy sell, right? Like once you've listened to me, for about 20 minutes, then you go, okay, so what you're saying is I can either not have fun at all and be less productive, or I can actually enjoy myself a little bit along the way and then be a better version and more productive. Like it becomes an easy sell once you see it that way. But then that's still just conjecture, right? You actually have to put it into play. And the problem is if we have been kind of in this mode and succumb to social norms for so long, like that first couple of weeks of taking a little bit of time off the table for yourself is uncomfortable, right? For some people it's guilt. There's so many different headwinds, right? Some people it's guilt. Some people it's addiction to these tools that are meant to be helpful, right? I've seen so many people that, to your point, it's sort of this act of mindfulness, right? Like they think they're spending time with their kids, but they're still checking every Slack notification and email that comes through, which like our mind, like kind of tricks us into thinking that we're spending, that this is leisure time with our kids. But our subconscious really knows it's an extension of work. Essentially, you haven't left work, right? And so like how when you actually look at that mindfully and you're being honest with yourself, like, are these times where you've really had a transition ritual from, you know, the dutiful things that you need to do into some time for yourself? And when you're not doing that, the outcome, right? I mean, most of us do. Like, we inherently know this, but yet, if we're not mindful of looking at our time, like we've habituated our behavior.
So I'm going to play devil's advocate a little bit, and this is
Sure.
something that came up when I was interviewing Cassie as well. Is there's still very much a paradigm in Western research on time of separating work and leisure, and that those are sort of it's like we need to like get our work done, and then during our leisure time, how are we going to be more present and mindful, engage with our kids, and have fun, and all of that. And what I really applied from your book this week was bringing the qualities of fun or challenge and engagement and enjoyment to all aspects of my life, and not having like this it's like in some ways people want to delineate when am I working, when am I not, which yes, I'm a fan of that, like having boundaries around when you're checking emails and things like that. And if we have an association with work is not fun, then we will spend most of our lives not having fun. Or if we have an association with being a parent is work, this concept of work, I think, needs to get turned on its head a little bit. And my intention in working with in my own work and also in working with my clients is getting tumbled a little bit to shift your ideas around what is actually a meaningful and enjoyable life and how it could be in every aspect of living, including washing the dishes and folding laundry and all of that.
I think you're spot on. So really that is like an intervention to understand the value of time, right? And so what we know is, and Cassie had some hand in this, but a lot of the research came out of the University of Pennsylvania, is that folks that have a sense of autonomy over their time. So that's very much the constructs that I play with, because my research was in autonomy's role in the workplace with regards to physiological and psychological well-being. Is that once we understand that we have autonomy over how we spend our time, whether that's in leisure or work, that's when the magic happens, right? And so the term we use for this is time affluence. So you're absolutely spot on. I think the problem is that some people don't have the privilege to have time affluence in their work. So as a broad-based intervention, making sure you have a transition ritual if you can't find autonomy in your work is like a, kind of an entryway into this. But you're absolutely spot on. Like if you can find autonomy throughout your 168 hours, that you're really off to the races. And so to the extent that you can find that, and in the book I talk about your relationship with leadership, like is it well communicated that where the goalpost is, so that you can then say, okay, I'm going to nail all this because we now have this social agreement about what needs to get done, and I'm going to figure out the fun ways of being able to do it. Because for so many of us in knowledge work, right, the goalpost always moves. Like if we're not really deliberate about communicating what the expectations are or asking leadership to tell us, then we get caught up in this infinite loop, right? Like essentially our to-do lists in this sort of new information age can consume all the time there is in our schedule, because there's always something to do, right? And so I'm right there with you. Like to the extent that you can find an area within work, but the problem, so we just talked about folks that are working for an employer, right? The problem with entrepreneurs is oftentimes where our work, like I love this saying, right? Like every entrepreneur hates their boss, right? Because it's like we can always expand new goals if we're not like, hey, this is what I want to hit this week, and I'm going to take some time off the table for myself. And then there's some folks, like I had a similar conversation that we're having now with Noah Kagan, who was playing devil's advocate as well. And he said, well, in my late 20s, like everything I did was with my friends and associated with work. And I wouldn't make an argument that that was wrong, because that was appropriate, right? Like they weren't necessarily working at 7 p.m., at a hackathon, drinking beers and creating code, even though it was contributing to work. Like that was still what he made that choice using his autonomy and agency, that's what he wanted to do. What I would suggest is, and based on evidence, is that a lot of us have gotten in such a mode that we don't know what fun is anymore. As weird as that sounds, it really does require a radical corrective, right? Like, and a good first step is knowing when you do want work to end, at least being mindful of that.
Well, I appreciated you encouraging us to first make a list of the agonizing aspects, as agonizing tasks of your life. And that is helpful. Agonizing, and also just sort of the time sucks that are meaningless and don't give anything back to you. Right. And some of them are, at least for me, were surprising, because there's one activity that I spend a lot of time doing with my kids, which is sitting on a beanbag watching basketball. My boys love basketball. It's like you say, I want to be there for my kids and do what they love. And it would be probably a lot more fun if we were playing basketball
There you
than if
go.
we were, if I were watching. So if I get up and shoot some hoops in our little mini hoop while we're watching basketball, all of a sudden that time is different than like laying on a beanbag, tuning out, kind of half watching basketball. So rethinking some of those, what is agonizing to you and also what is mindless.
I find when people are in that mode, like oftentimes they'll want to displace the discomfort too, because they like really enjoy the fact that there's this, but like, 6 times out of 10, they'll pick up their phone because they're engaging in that activity. I'm not saying you're doing it, but I'd be curious, because a lot of people that, that's a very, uh, I think that is the right thing, right? But when you do get in that mode where you're like, this isn't a good, like you just kind of know, right? And then so you'll start to do things to distract yourself from that discomfort.
So I don't pick up my phone. We have a hard, fast, double screen rule in our house, where
Perfect.
one
Yeah.
screen at a time. You cannot be on 2 screens at once. Uh, but what I do is I pick up my mind. So I can go into my own head and just like plan out blah, 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 think about yada, 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 yada. And then I'm not really there watching basketball with my kids. I'm like planning out some talk I'm going to give. And so that's my version of the phone. It's like that was the phone before we had phones. It's just the phones are easier. Is we have our minds to go to. And then I just feel dissatisfied, right? So I would much rather be going for a hike with my kids or doing something that's active and engaging, as opposed to passive, which lends to the making the fun file, which was also fun. It's a list of uh, you said 12 to 10 to
What
15, which is a sweet
8
spot, and
to
12 is
15,
like
yeah,
8 to 15
yeah.
of activities that are fun. And it was interesting to look at those activities because most of them are things that I could pick up and do in the next minute if I
That's
wanted
awesome.
to. They are not like they require very little setup. And yet I'm not doing them. I mean, I'm doing them sometimes, but not as much as I would like to be doing them. What's in your fun file?
Reconnecting with friends. So I just got uh, reconnected with Paul Zak. Are you familiar? You know, the hug
Mm.
doctor. He talks a lot about
Oh,
oxytocin, and
okay.
so yeah, I was like, and I talk about that. Oxytocin being important. So reconnecting with friends, because again, I had habituated, especially like getting ready for the book launch. Not really connecting with people. So really trying to make an effort to invite people into our space so that I'm getting interactions with folks, whether that's on Zoom or preferably in person. I'm still trying to write because once you get into the editing mode, you kind of forget to write. So I've been picking that back up because that's a lot of fun for me. We're on the cusp of getting a dog because uh, pet owner or pet caregiving for me is one of the funnest things that it just always lights me up. And my wife said you cannot have a dog until all of this is over because I was
Oh.
traveling a lot and writing, and which is totally fair because she's not a dog person. So that's like on my list. We'll probably get one in May. And then watching my kids, like I just really love engaging with their sports and cheering them on. And to your point, playing basketball with my son. And, I write in the book about my daughter and I taking dance classes. She's now aged out of that, unfortunately, but she's just crushing it in gymnastics. So going and just watching her path on mastery is amazing. Yeah.
And it does freshen you up a little bit when you insert fun, and if you insert it in a way, especially for me, if I'm stacking it next to something that's kind of hard, I went in with a little bit of a fresh mindset and a little more energy and a little more focus because I fed that need for myself first. So I
Yeah.
love the fun file. Yeah.
Well, and I appreciate that. And I think it dovetails into another thing that I don't talk about enough in the book, but this idea, you know, that these opportunities for renewal in the middle, what I did, because a big construct in the book is about using agency and autonomy, right? The idea that if you have these breaks, like how important reclaiming your lunch break is, especially if you're feeling burnt out by work, like just playing with that construct. Like, how can you have fun in the middle of your day? There was an amazing article in the Wall Street Journal, right, about these couples that are reconnecting with their partner because they realize their life is too over engineered in the
Hmm.
evening to be able to connect, as a partnership. So they're going to have lunch with each other because, they work at different locations and how important that is. It doesn't matter if you don't have a partner. Like, can you connect with a friend? If you're an introvert like my wife, can you read a good book during lunch just so that you're like stepping away? And we so discount that, right? Because we've been so fed this social norm that if we're not being productive, somehow our self-worth is at risk, right? And yet if we do take these breaks and we're okay with that mild discomfort of like, oh wait, if I just work through lunch I could finish a little bit earlier, which is a total lie, right? Again, because our to-do lists are endless. If you take that break, you actually are so much more productive the second half. And again, just another argument for why fun is important.
So you were mentioning autonomy, which is one aspect of fun, of feeling like it's your choice. You're not forced into the fun. You're choosing to do this because it's what fits for you. But you also talk about some of the characteristics of peak experiences. So we have fun, and then we also have like a lot of fun. And I love peak experiences, and we can actually turn simple things into peak experiences. But one of the characteristics you draw from video gaming and looking at leveling up and that sort of balance between challenge and also feeling a sense of mastery. Can you talk about peak experiences and how we can cultivate more of those in our life?
Yeah, man, this was kind of a nod to Cheek Set Me High, right? I think flow had
Mhm.
been so explored. I just wanted to share it in that context because it gave people another frame, right? But what we know is that, some of the funnest moments are when we are able to dilate time in that fashion to get ourselves in flow. And so you described it beautifully, right? We know flow exists when we are really connected to something, so we feel that connection. And the reason why, that crosshairs of sort of feeling like we're using the skills we have, but not necessarily it's so easy. So we're bored. So we're like, like, for instance, cycling on the flat road, if you're a mountain biker, right? Like eventually that's going to kind of get boring and take your mind out of it. You're going to get back into that mind wandering state that you suggested, with your kids watching basketball. So those peak experiences when we find ourselves so connected with something like, wow, I'm really crushing this, like I love reading research about like ballet dancers, and for whatever reason a lot's been done on tennis players, like when they're just hitting their stride and really great at what they're doing, but not having to think about it so much, like, again, ballet dancer doing a challenging dance, or a tennis player, outmatched by a more skilled player, then that gets you into anxiety, right? Like, holy cow, like I'm not, and so that's not fun either, right? Like it can definitely lead to betterment, but it's not necessarily a peak experience, because most of us are going to look back and maybe we'll be fond of that because it's like, wow, that was really challenging, but it wasn't necessarily fun, right? And so it's really those moments when we're able to use this tool set that we've developed, so that to some degree we're sort of, proud of our accomplishment and the fact that we are so connected to the thing that we're doing, we kind of lose track of everything else except like this, beautiful dance that we have with whatever that thing is you're doing, whether it's rock climbing, whether again it's a spiritual practice, whether it's some sort of sport, whatever it is, it's just transcending sort of, the ordinary world, and then just feeling so connected with that thing we know leads to betterment. And it really makes us feel good. It leads to better resilience. If the connection is intimate, obviously it increases oxytocin, which, yeah, anyways, blah blah blah, but there's just a whole host of validated benefits from hitting that spot. And then for some, I talk about it in the book, risk and edge work is also, a fun way. That's not going to work for everyone, right? Because some people, depending on your safety needs, won't find that area fun. But for, that risk of, potentially something going bad can really be invigorating for some as well. So if that is you, playing with aspects of um, safety and exhilaration, can be ways to reach transcendence as well.
Well, people often think about risk and edge work as like, going down I'm friends with Sonia Looney, who's a mountain biker and professional mountain biker. And I watch her sometimes on Instagram, like, what? How are you doing this? She's going down some crazy mountain. But I also think that we can live in the realm of risk and edge work just by our own intimacy with each other and with other human beings. Like we can have peak experiences with other human beings. I'm not even talking about like sexual peak experience. I mean like a peak experience when you step in and get really close and intimate with somebody and are willing to be like ride that edge of being vulnerable or ride the edge of being honest about something. That is exhilarating and a peak experience. So everyone's edge is different. And I actually had one of these peak experiences just this past week before my week of dreaded fun, where um, I was with this group. I got invited to this group. They're called the Mandala Mamas. I guess
Not
I am
familiar.
I am a well, you're not familiar because there's only 6 of us or 8 of us and we're in Santa Barbara, but I am
Okay.
one of them now. And we go into places in nature and bring supplies of natural items, so like flowers and rocks and sea glass, and we co-create a mandala
Oh, that's
together.
awesome.
And so we made this huge, it was so cool. It was like we made this huge mandala on the beach, together. We did a whole ritual around it and all of that. But it was a peak experience because of that flow state of just working side by side and co-creating something. And I think artists have this, children have this.
We always have to give things a term, right? I think
Yeah.
collective effervescence is often the word we use.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Harmonious passions. But what ends up happening is that our lives are so structured and scheduled or forced that we don't give the space and time to co-create something. None of us knew what we were creating when we started. And by the end, we were like, whoa, that was amazing. And then by the next morning, it was gone. because it's on the beach and it's just all going
Yeah,
to be washed
yeah.
away. And we videoed the whole thing on a, what is it, time lapse. So you can
Oh,
watch the
that's
whole thing
awesome.
being created. It's on Instagram. But that whole experience was like the highlight of the week. And then I think about that, like, how could we bring that type of fun into more, into our cooking, into our relating with one another?
I really like this might get us off on a tangent, but I really
Yeah.
do like the idea. I meant, because of the Good Life book doing so well, this year, and rightfully so, because it's an amazing piece of research. But, you know, the spotlight on loneliness and how terrible it is and how many of us have succumbed to it.
Yeah.
And so, I hate over quantifying things. I talk about that in the book because that's essentially what got me to my pit of despair, right? I
Don't
do,
track everything. Yes.
yeah, but I think, to some degree, if you're deliberate about taking those risks, even if you're an introvert, and exploring emotional vulnerability so that you can sort of develop emotional flexibility, as we call it, like those are things that we know elicit, oxytocin, make you believe in humanity because for the most part people are good. There are going to be disappointments, so that's part of the risk, right? If there weren't, then it wouldn't be a scary thing, right? We'd all be hugging each other and whatever. But I mean, they become really important, right? Study after study suggests, like, and I love this because it's not just statistically significant, it's almost always like the entire sample group, that in any of these spontaneous situations, whether it be on a train, or in an elevator or whatever, if you just say, hello, how are you, to a complete stranger, it leads to these like wondrous moments. Right. And so, anyways, I love that. I want to pay homage to how important that little nugget you gave is, and how so many of us just think we're going to be bothering the other person, which is so unfortunate. I believe that's contributing to some of the reasons why, we just don't feel connected anymore.
Yeah. And I can also say that there were barriers, internal and external, to go do an activity like that. So internal barriers being my own social anxiety. I only knew one other person in the group. I don't know all these other people. What do you wear to a mandala event at the beach? I'm not going to fit in. And and then the external barriers of how am I going to carve out there was, sort of this chunk of time to go do this thing that was, in a lot of ways not productive in any way, right? So we those are the barriers I think that come up frequently for us around having fun. Either I'm going to look like an idiot so I can't really let loose, or I don't have, sort of time. And that's where psychological flexibility comes in, because when you step back and you look at your life and you look at, okay, over this past week, what were the best parts of the week? They were not doing stuff that's in that anguish file.
Right.
And they were not in the, like, it was the best part of the week was when I got all my notes written or got my house cleaned up or got my taxes done or whatever. They were about connecting, engaging, and living in that edge a little bit. So uh, we need more fun, or maybe we want more fun.
And I think important to bring up, this becomes hard to talk about episodically. I think, you
Yeah.
really do need to swim in this research, but why those things are important, right, is because they encode a memory that you just told me in rich detail. And when we habituate the things that we do, I mean, some of those we do need to do, right? Like to run a marathon, you need to kind of find your cadence and get in a groove, right? And so it's a good metaphor for life. But if you're not prioritizing experiences like you just shared, what we know is when we get older, we look back at a life that seems pretty short because, for better or worse, our brains are hard drives, right? And so if they're not filled with a lot of really rich, unique experiences where we've encoded, rich sort of sensory data about how that took place, then we're just sort of like, oh, okay, well, I did the thing,
Mhm.
instead of like, what, your life being a mosaic. And that really is where you get resilience later in life and becomes extremely important. I mean, most of us are familiar with Bronnie Ware's work. And if you look at, the regrets that she unearthed from all these interviews of people that close to death, they all have to do with, not spending enough time doing these types of things. And so, but it's complex. You got to sort of understand how time dilates, right? I mean, it's so
Mhm.
easy for us to go, okay, that's fine, but right now, I've got things to do. Like, I'd be a little bit careful with that thought.
Yeah. Well, you talk a bit about running the Ironman, and the way you talk about it is not about like your feeling of accomplishment for running an Ironman or now I am, I mean, you do say now I'm an Ironman, but you talk more about the people that showed up for you and that boost of energy you got at the end and the experience of it.
Well, and I think it's a good aspect. I mean, you tell me, because again, I always preface that I'm an organizational psychologist, but I think, you know, good clinical mental hygiene comes from the ability to hold both things, right? Like, again, I've been A type my whole life. So to suggest that you shouldn't be outcome focused, like that just wouldn't be an authentic claim from me, because I do like to pursue goals. But I think to the extent that you can also say, I'm going to really enjoy the experience. And if the outcome fails, I'll still look back at this time in an enjoyable manner, instead of like, now all that time was wasted and what the hell was I doing? Right. Like, you essentially really set yourself up for failure. And so there's two things to unpack from the Ironman story. One is that, right? Like, yes, I wanted to accomplish the goal, but at the end of the day, as cliche as it is, I wanted to enjoy the journey. But two, when you create aspects of the journey that are enjoyable, you do the work. Like, the reason that I
Mhm.
enjoyed running was because I didn't wear like a goofy singlet that would make me embarrassed every time, I hit the playa to do my training miles, right? Like, I put in headphones and like wore comfortable clothes that I liked. And
Yeah.
again, I rigged the bike. You're not allowed to wear headphones on the bike for reasons that should make sense, right? You're not going to hear oncoming cars and things like that. So I found a workaround. I put an aerodynamic stereo on my bike so I could listen to tunes. And then I was respectful of the fellow riders that thought that was obnoxious. I would
Yeah,
turn
as a fellow runner, I find that obnoxious. When someone rides by on their bike with their tunes loud, I'm like, "Psst, hey."
yeah.
But yes, you gotta turn it down as you approach. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, fun couples well with kindness.
Mhm.
So just show a little
Yeah.
bit of kindness too.
Yeah. Yes, 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 yes. So I'm not saying all outcomes are not that we shouldn't be focusing on outcomes and just only it's the most likely for most people that are listening to this podcast, they're at a balance towards leaning a little bit towards too much of productivity and outcome and endpoint and I'll be happy when. And so so I will probably always lean the other way in my messaging just to get you back to center. And it's sort of like yoga, right? So if you're too heavy on one side, you got to lean to the other side to find the middle.
And that's where you get the most innovative solutions. So it goes beyond just resilience and having vigor and vitality the next day. I mean, for folks that really want to be peak performers, it's also a good practice in regards to being able to being your most creative self, right? Because when we do kind of get stuck in our rhythms and routines and habituated behavior, then we don't really allow outside thought in, right? Because we're just like, I do and, get along to get along. And so, which is so
Yeah.
unfortunate.
Well, I appreciate what you said there. And there's a line in your book where you say happiness is a state of mind, but fun is something you do. And getting out of those ruts and getting into sort of nonlinear thinking is often behavior first, mind change later. So it's in some ways, it's just like you got to dive in and do something different and have some variability and do the behavior. This is very much when you're working with folks with depression, behavioral activation, you help people start engaging in more pleasurable activities before they even feel like they're pleasurable, right? So engaging in fun activities, letting the activity change you.
There's generally three things we can play with. Sometimes it's just
Mhm.
environments that make you feel good. That could be the beach. It could be a grocery store, right? It could be your friend's house. Um, then the friends that you have, right? Like, naturally, we just have friends that lift us up. Like, maybe they're not the ones you want to start a business with, but when you hang out with them, you're going to walk away, and be like, oh, that was just a good time. Like, oftentimes you can just take a step back as an anthropologist and be like, can I challenge the belief that it has to be done this way, and combine it with your own sensibilities and preferences? And oftentimes just that, right? Someone turned something that we're like, I hated to do that, into something to actually enjoy doing.
Mhm. Wonderful. So those are 3 ways: change your environment, change who you do it with, and then change the activity itself and sort of think about those in this context of more fun. So tell me one thing as we close that you're going to do that's fun today.
I am going to go play with my kids this weekend, like I already mentioned. I'm
Mhm.
just so into that. Both of them are on such a pathway of mastery that it's just really fun to watch. And that, at the early stages where you can kind of see, you can get like the awe and wonder from seeing them sort of light up, because it might seem sort of ordinary to you, but just to see them so excited about like mastering a new move. Yeah,
That's
thank you.
good. They are fun. Okay, well, thank you so much. For those that wanna pick up, the fun habit, we just tapped a little bit into the research today, but you kind of like every other sentence is a research study. So for those folks that like science, this is the book for you. If that's your window end to being motivated to do some of this, you will be motivated by the science. And obviously, we'll connect with your other stuff in the show notes as well. So thanks so much for spending this hour.
Thank you so much for having me.